No.
Well, with the same intent.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, not a
yeah.
problem.
No, I mean we have so the smoking cessation working group that we have going is kind of small, like 8 people, about 8 to 10 people. But we did invite the wider cancer center community to
Mhm.
attend this. So
And then is the time, because I saw it reserved 10 to 11 or 11:30.
it's 10 to 11, I think.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. I'll probably talk through the first part rather quickly,
Okay.
because
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm kind of making a baseline assumption that everyone participating kind of knows all the risks and the harms
Yeah.
portion of it.
So we'll give people 5 more minutes and then we'll get started.
Okay, very
Yeah.
good. See Dr. Wills there too. How you doing?
Okay. All right. Olaf, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
All right, good.
Like, I told Chrissy I'm multitasking here. We're supposed to get our reports from HMSA, but they supposedly upgraded their system, but that means certain things just stop working. So I'm trying to download my document. And it says this PDF is not available, and it's been that way for the past several days. So something you guys don't have to deal with, hopefully.
With the insurance companies,
Oh yeah.
yeah, yeah, we don't have to deal with them.
No,
So,
my neighbor is a physician in Kaimaki, and he had an article in the Star Advertiser about the insurance companies. He was not happy with them. He said they've
yes,
taken over the practice of medicine.
yes. Who's your neighbor?
Oh, his name is Steve Dang, Dang.
Oh, okay, okay. I don't know him, so.
He's an internist, I think,
Mhm.
but just happened to be a neighbor, and his mother lives next to us, who's been a family friend for many years.
Ah, very good.
Yeah.
All right. Oh yeah, we have more than enough people for Hollywood Squares.
All right. Guess we give people 1 more minute and we get started.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
Trying to remember who the host was. Was that Richard Dawson or for Hollywood Squares? Anybody
Oh,
remember?
no, it wasn't Richard
Was it
Dawson. It was somebody else.
with Tom Bergeron or I don't know.
Gene Eubanks? Does that
It
ring a
wasn't
bell?
Monty Hall.
It's
Monty Hall
good.
is a different one.
Well, that was Let's Make a Deal. Yeah, let's
Yeah.
make a deal. Eh?
All right, I guess we get started in the interest of time. Uh, let me, we're fortunate today to have Dr. Bryan Mee joining us as part of the smoking cessation working group here at the UH Cancer Center. He's kindly agreed to give a presentation to us. Dr. Mee is a board-certified pediatrics and a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics. He's a clinical professor of pediatrics at JAPSOM. He has received several awards at JAPSOM. Since 2010, he's been the medical director for the Kapiolani Smoke-Free Families Tobacco and Nicotine Cessation Program at Kapiolani Medical Center for Women and Children. He sits on the National American Academy of Pediatrics Executive Committee for the section on nicotine tobacco prevention and treatment. He's also the Tobacco Control Chair and the e-cigarette chapter champion for the AAP Hawaii chapter, and he has served on the board of directors for the Hawaii Public Health Institute. So, without wasting more time, I'd like to invite Dr. Mee to the floor. I'd like to hand the floor over to Dr. Mee. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you all for participating today. It's good to see you all. I will kind of zip through the first half of it because I've been asked to talk a little bit more about the treatment. And I know you all are people who understand a lot about this topic. So we'll just go ahead and get started here. Oops, there we go. Okay, so some of the information here, the medical director for Kapiolani Smoke-Free Families, it's supported by the HCF. My perspective is one of a pediatrician who's in clinical practice. So you can kind of see my bias for that in a way, but I also participate in the American Academy of Pediatrics section on nicotine and tobacco prevention and treatment. And we do come up with the national guidelines, which are, reviewed and updated every, 5 to 7 years. And it's published by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And we'll go over some of those in the latter half of the talk. And again, any images are just for illustration. There's no endorsement of any products. And I definitely do not make any money from doing this. Okay. Acknowledgements, again, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the section on nicotine and tobacco prevention and treatment, and also the Julius B. Richmond Center of Excellence, which was originally funded by the lawsuit by the flight attendants against, the big tobacco folks from Hawaii Public Health Institute, Bonnie Halpern Felsher from Stanford, Bryan A. King, who's now the director of the Center for Tobacco Products at the FDA, and Forrest Batts, who also worked with me at Hi-Fi on the board. They all have some contributions to some of the information presented here. So we're going to go over youth vaping. We know that there's higher rates here in Hawaii. Again, some of this is review for you folks. Go over the vaping devices, go over the adverse health outcomes, talk about screening for vaping, e-cigarette, and other nicotine use. And again, more of it is to initiate our discussion for the latter portion as well. So if you have questions during, or if this is information that is old hat to you, just tell me and I will skip to the next slide. You guys know about the terminology, but I always go over, what do we call these things? Electronic cigarettes, e-cigs, electronic smoking devices, electronic nicotine delivery systems, vaping devices, or vape pens. The industry itself has tried to push the use of the word vaping and vapors, and it looks like they've actually won that battle, because in common parlance, everyone calls these vapes, vape pens. People vape or are vapors. And so the initial, when they first came out, we were hoping to associate electronic devices using nicotine as some form of cigarettes, which has the connotation from all the decades of work that we've done to associate the adverse health effects. However, they've been able to decouple it somewhat, and in a lot of the public's mind, there is a perception that these devices are less harmful than the traditional combusted tobacco. Again, this is a whole nother discussion we could have, but I always like to introduce this at the very beginning so that we establish our baseline of understanding and terminology. again, everyone knows this, nicotine, highly addictive, works on the brain's reward system, works on the dopamine release. As researchers, I know many of you know even more about the specific receptors and the feedback loop that happens here. But again, nicotine, highly addictive. We know that it affects brain development until the mid-20s. So some of this basic information has led to the policy recommendations, such as the Tobacco 21. Some folks have even advocated for limiting or restricting tobacco purchase until age 25 or even later. And so some of this information was provided in the U.S. Surgeon General's report all the way back in 2016. Also, the formulation of the nicotine in electronic devices is different from what we call the free-base nicotine. So the nicotine salts are basically formed by taking our free-base nicotine, adding benzoic acid, which is the specific recipe used by the folks over at Juul, and turning these into nicotine salts. This is the quote from Liquid Nicotine Wholesalers that says, "You can vape higher nicotine salt strengths without that rough throat hit." So in a summary, that's how I like to think about it, is that it kind of takes away some of that harshness of smoking or inhaling nicotine in its usual form. And so that also allows you to have a higher concentration within these pods or other electronic devices. Again, people think about how the substances used in there are FDA approved, but however, they're FDA approved for ingestion and not inhalation. So a lot of times the solutions include a large amount of propylene glycol, sometimes vegetable glycerin. But again, these are not approved for inhalation. So this just kind of reviews some of the information that we just talked about. And then there's also other components in there that are carcinogenic, some heavy metals as well. So the solvent that we talk about, typically propylene glycol or glycerol, if you heat it or inhale it, it'll pass into the pulmonary arteries, into the pulmonary veins, and then you get irritation of the endothelium. This will affect blood flow, clotting, and your immune response, particularly within the pulmonary system. And so, the summary of this is that vaping or using e-cigarettes leads to reduced vascular function, especially within the pulmonary system. Next, we talk about the flavors. So people think of flavors as being something you just add and it makes it taste better or smell better. However, the flavorings are not natural substances. It's not that squeeze a lemon in your drink. It is actually some sort of chemical that your body will interpret as similar to one of the natural flavors or flavors that your tongue or nose can recognize. So some of these e-cigarette flavors are airway irritants. So the cherry flavor, the cinnamon flavor, and the buttery flavor, which is not kind of fallen out of fifth flavor, but previously caused the popcorn lung, which was kind of a easy coincidence to put together buttery flavor and popcorn lung. And then when you put the two together, the flavorings plus the propylene glycol, produce things that are even more airway irritants. So some of the information out there shows that when you mix some of the chemicals that are the flavor aldehydes and you mix it with the propylene glycol, then you can produce acetals, which activate the TRPA1 and the TRPV1 irritant receptors in the airway, and then that leads to some of the clinical symptoms such as the chronic cough and the inflammation. And then other substances, the VOCs or volatile organic compounds, they did the study on actually young people, which is pretty interesting because a lot of the studies have been done on adults. It is a lot harder to get consent for folks under 18 to participate in studies. So in this one, urine was analyzed for metabolites of 8 VOCs. The average age of the participants was 16 and a half years old, And when they studied the urine, they had 5 VOCs at levels up to 3 times greater than in the controls. And 4 out of these 5 VOCs are known carcinogens. This is actually Dr. Wills, you know this one very well. So this was the study that showed that it was a meta-analysis that showed that using e-cigarettes by someone who's never smoked before or used e-cigarettes before led to 4 times greater odds of future cigarette smoking. Flavors we recognize, and we've kind of put this into policy play as well as a very important topic because a lot of young people start electronic smoking devices because of the flavor. It makes it easier to use overall. So mask some of the harshness. It gives you something as a positive reinforcement to inhale more deeply. And so flavors do lead to increased nicotine use. Other health effects throughout the body. So just kind of briefly, you kind of track the path of your inhalation. So in the mouth, you can increase the chance of cracked teeth, tongue, and inner cheek pain. We've kind of talked about the airways already, but it does lead to the increase of inflammation, decrease in immune activity, and lead to bronchitis. Also, we talked about the vascular effects. So you can have symptoms such as chest pain and increased stiffness of the arteries. Apparently, it does double your chance of heart attack. Gastrointestinal symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, heartburn, and eventually possibly stomach ulcers. There's some information that the e-cigarettes can also increase the risk of bladder cancer. So a lot of times we think about the lungs, but since it's passing by the teeth, the propylene glycol can do things like soften the tooth enamel and cause more bacteria to stay there, as well as some of the flavorings. And then the nicotine itself is also not helpful as well to your oral health. We think about in pediatrics, not just when the children are our patients, but also before. So during pregnancy, nicotine use by pregnant women is a significant issue. So it's also hard to do studies that are really good regarding e-cigarette use during pregnancy, but a lot of the animal studies have shown or suggested adverse effects with fetal brain development, lung development, increased risk of low birth weight, premature delivery, stillbirth, and possibly after being born, increased risk of sudden infant death. And then EVOLI, which came on the scene and was talked about a whole bunch, and then COVID came along and it's kind of been forgotten, but it's still something that we think about. So it gives you respiratory, GI, and constitutional symptoms. The vitamin E acetate was the substance that was implicated, and basically it disrupts the surfactant layer so that you have respiratory dysfunction due to disruption of the surface tension. And also heating it up within the e-cigarette devices can produce ketones, which can be lung irritants. The CDC had been collecting information on EVOLI case reports when we first had the epidemic of EVOLI cases. And then they stopped in February 2020 due to the increased rates of COVID and the need to reallocate resources. Some of the states did continue to collect a little bit more information, such as in California. However, I haven't seen that much more, unless one of you folks have seen information on this. The difficulty with that is there's a lot of overlap in symptoms between EVOLI and COVID. The cases of EVOLI that get you bad enough to end up in the ICU, that was an initial big public relations scare for the companies that sell these devices. and now it's kind of been buried. I would love to see more information on this. There's a lot of difficulty in parsing out from the clinical side, whether it's EVOLI or COVID, and also some difficulty in trying to get the resources together to look at it some more. Also, for a lot of our adolescents, they are not folks that use these devices themselves. However, their friends use it or whoever they hang out with. There's some peer pressure that comes into play as well, but just the physical presence of being around secondhand vape exposure does increase the risk of asthma attacks, for young people who do have asthma, but they themselves don't use the product. The National Youth Tobacco Service survey in 2019 kind of broke down the reasons for using e-cigarettes in middle and high school students. They start out due to curiosity or other, people around them using it. So we see that as well. And then some of the components or the intrinsic qualities of them, such as the flavors or being able to do various things with them. So a lot of this falls into the categories of other people are using them, so I want to use them, or they seem interesting due to some reason, whether flavors or they're just around, or social media influencers, or peer pressure. So those are the typical reasons that young people get started on these devices. A lot of times the industry will talk about using e-cigarettes to so-called quit smoking. This was a statistical risk analysis. I like to pull it out just to talk about how, you may have anecdotal information where someone says, oh yeah, I was able to use e-cigarettes to quit regular cigarettes. But the fact that these are out in the market and readily available means that young people are able to access them. So the risk is that, or the trade-off is, you can have your adult quit, but your chances of a young person picking up the habit and being addicted to nicotine is much higher. So this risk model showed that 2,070 adult smokers could successfully quit, okay, but having these products out in the market would lead to 168,000 new smokers. So, if you do the math here, the ratio is 1 adult to 81 young people. So even if this doesn't play out exactly as much, there is a trade-off between having someone quit and having young people pick up the habit. And so this is what I use to kind of counter the argument that these are useful cessation aids. Okay, so this is the part where we'll go over some of the information that the committee that I sit on, the section on nicotine and tobacco prevention and treatment, we came up with these guidelines. And so they were recently published in May of this year in pediatrics. And so you can actually read it, and there are 3 companion articles that come together. So we put together first the technical report, which has more of the rigorous evidence on there and review of the data that's available. And then the policy statement is a document that gives recommendations for how we should proceed on a public health level. And then the clinical report is a good document for folks like me to use who are in clinical practice, but it's also useful for folks who are interested in intervention for young people in terms of reducing or eliminating tobacco or nicotine use. So these 3 articles go together, and we'll just kind of go over the information that's in there. So for anyone who misses this discussion, basically this is just all in there in these articles that are available free online. So if you search for it, under AAP, tobacco and nicotine, you'll be able to find it. And again, it's in the May 2023 edition of Pediatrics. So the first section, so there's a section that talks about each of these. So this is just for the section addressing tobacco and nicotine use in children and adolescents, so young people. So what should we do? These three things: screen them, include prevention as part of the anticipatory guidance, and offer treatment to use tobacco products. So basically our ask, advise, and refer model. So that first one on there says that screening questions are effective. We know that already. And so move on to the next thing. Recommendation is to counsel all youth. And the timing of that is actually as soon as children can understand the messaging. So like my kids are 7 years old, but since they were 4 or 5, you know, if they see someone using a device like this, I kind of let them know, you know, those e-cigarette devices or the smoking, not good for you, right? So just simple things like that. It will hurt your lungs. It will not make you healthy. You'll get more sick, but definitely no later than middle school age, because that's when there's an uptick in initiation among young people. Probably high school is a little bit too late because there's a large chunk of people who've already started by then. So the part that we want to focus on, the third part, offering treatment to patients who do use tobacco products. So again, our recommendation for pediatricians is to refer adolescents who want to quit to behavioral interventions. The quality of evidence for that is moderate. The strength is strong. Again, the quality of evidence is just due to not having sufficient studies in adolescents, but the evidence for this in adults is pretty strong. So behavioral interventions means one-on-one counseling or group counseling, or using various modalities such as telephone, computer, or print, which is kind of the older information, which is why, you know, some of the older studies suggested those, but in practice and some of the newer information, we found that text messaging or using a specific smartphone app is more effective and kind of the way that young people prefer to communicate these days, although I'm sure something else new will come out and we'll be behind the trend as adults to try to figure that out. So that's always the challenge with young people. The second portion of the treatment discussion is, should we use NRT? And this was kind of debatable for a while, but our section on nicotine and tobacco, you know, decided that NRT is considered to be safe, especially when you compare with the use of other tobacco products. So, you know, actually quite a while ago, Jonathan Winikoff, who works over at Harvard and UMass, he had advocated for using NRT in all kinds of populations, because he says that either you're using a nicotine product that's not well regulated and has a zillion other you know, components in it, or you're just giving them the same nicotine without all those other zillion things. And so that's kind of how I like to think about it. Again, using NRT by itself, yeah, it's okay, but definitely more effective when you use it with the behavioral interventions as discussed in the first half of the treatment section. Again, you can find the resources here at the aap.org website /cessation. I'll have links to everything as well, but again, these are readily available, free, easy to find. The second part of our clinical report basically addresses the parent or caregiver, basically the family member who uses tobacco. So it kind of follows the same pattern: ask about it, advise, and then also refer for treatment. But the third section there is also do not recommend e-cigarettes for tobacco cessation. So again, the first part we all know about, and it's been talked about a zillion times. So go ahead and ask, because if you don't ask, you're not going to know. And pediatricians, we have unique access to the whole family and being able to ask about the rest of the family as well. So that is definitely part of what we want to do in our clinical encounter. The second part, again, counsel them, and also implement a screening sort of regimen within your electronic health record, so your EHR. So have the screening question come up every single time at each appointment. Sometimes you may not get the same answer each time too. And so, a lot of times folks will come in, they'll just had a new baby. They're like, oh yeah, nobody's smoking right now, or nobody's using e-cigarettes, but you catch them 6 months later, they're stressed out over a crying baby. They've gone back to using again. Or someone else has moved in with them, family member to help out, or something else has changed situationally. So having this come up as an automatic prompt has shown to be effective in doing the screening, rather than having a person have to remember each time, this is part of what, we need to screen on the social history. We put it on the front end and have it automatically come up. Also, pediatricians are supposedly allowed to prescribe NRT and other things to family members. In practice, it doesn't happen as much, but that is one recommendation, again, from the AAP on the national level. E-cigarettes, not approved as a cessation device. We know why, but there's also variable nicotine dosing when you use these things, because they tend to have an early nicotine peak, or the amount of nicotine that's in the liquid is not what's on the label. So sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. So that variability will affect your level of addiction as well, and not work as well as a controlled NRT that's prescribed by a physician under a controlled cessation plan. The fourth one is just eliminating secondhand smoke or aerosol as much as possible. The evidence for this is so-so, but smoke-free homes and cars is somewhat helpful in reducing triggers. Unfortunately, the evidence for this is just okay. The last portion of the recommendation in terms of actions on the clinical side is to incorporate teaching how to ask, advise, and refer, and also do the treatment portion of tobacco and nicotine cessation within our medical school and residency curricula. I remember going through my training programs, and we do a lot of the screening portion, but we don't really figure out the portion where we do treatment and how to manage that as well. So that's something that we would be recommending to include as part of the educational process as well. And then more specifically, this is the information that the AAP, again, our committee came up with in terms of how do we do NRT. So NRT for combustible cigarettes has been somewhat standardized over time. 1 pack per day equals 1 patch, so forth. With the e-cigarettes, we found more variability and more difficulty, especially with the young people. But the baseline is to make sure that we at least meet their nicotine need and then work from there. So again, cessation for young people is just asking the questions appropriately, and then providing the advice and guidance using motivational interviewing rather than didactics. And then there's a few screening questions on there: hooked on nicotine, e-cigarette dependence scale, or the modified Fagerstrom tolerance questionnaire. The way to do a successful quit plan is never easy, and it's fraught with challenges. First of all, you're talking with young people, especially teenagers, but if they are willing to talk about it, that's actually a good first step, and then you can help guide them. But again, some people have difficulty trying to set up a successful quit plan. So in practice, what you want to do is do a complete quit, not just kind of wean down, but just stop everything, identify your triggers, talk about the symptoms. We also talk about, when you first wake up, how soon until you crave your first, vape dose. Social support is important as well. Depending on the adolescents, sometimes the parents know, sometimes they don't. So that makes it a little bit more challenging at times. And also, who do they hang out with? Are their friends ones that also use the product, or are they, ones that don't, and they're able to help support? I've had a patient that quit, and the people he hangs out with are still using vaping devices, but they were cool with him not doing it. So it just depends on what kind of peer group they're within. And then talking about other things such as healthy eating, exercise has been found to be pretty helpful, because when you're exercising, you're usually not using these devices. Although, I've seen, I go play basketball, I see some of my peers in between games will pick up their vape pens and just start taking a few hits off of that. Cessation support services. So there are several out there. The smokefreeteen.gov. This is quitting. That's run by the Truth Initiative. 1-800-QUIT NOW, which is the National Tobacco Quit line, and each state has a specific one. So Hawaii's one will connect you locally. Behavioral counseling, or CBT as well. So those are all useful things. Be positive and encouraging, and know that there may be relapse as well. So you want to stay on that positive side and be their partner. If you have that discussion with them and they say, you know what, not ready, at least talk about cutting back, or let them know that you're going to discuss it again in the future, so that they may change their mind at some point in time. But again, it is a big challenge. And the pharmacotherapy, this is the one, probably the number one question that we have from the clinical practitioners, because from my standpoint as someone in the office, I want to be able to identify it, prescribe something, and just mentally be able to file it away, right, and move on to the next thing. So in terms of what we can recommend on the clinical side, there's been difficulty because a lot of the things we know that are effective in adults have not been approved for people under 18, and also the research has been limited in terms of how efficacious it is. Some of the initial research showed that there wasn't huge benefit to using NRT for adolescents. However, our group has decided that the evidence is strong enough in adults, and because the harms of dependence are so significant, for youth that are moderately or severely addicted, again, using those questionnaires to determine moderate and severe addiction, we can prescribe off-label NRT for young people. So that's also the other difference. These products are over the counter for adults, but if you're under 18, you actually need a prescription from your doctor, which is kind of interesting. So we go ahead and do that. We recommend being able to use the baseline with a patch, and then pair it with either a gum or lozenge are probably the easiest ones to get. So that way you get a steady level of nicotine to kind of keep them at one level. But for cravings, you use either the gum or the lozenge. And again, as always, combine it with behavioral counseling. So a lot of the questions are, is it safe to use? And again, I go back to, well, you're basically getting rid of all the other toxic chemicals and carcinogens that you would be otherwise exposed to, and just replacing it with nicotine itself in a controlled environment, which you're gradually weaning down. And the NRT that has been approved, so the patches and the gums and the lozenge, they are different from the nicotine that you get from your vape pen, because it's released slowly, especially from the patch. So slowly and gradually, so that you can decrease the level over time. Contraindications to using NRT is just hypersensitivity to nicotine, or specific patients who are allergic to soy, aren't supposed to use the lozenge just because of the makeup of it. And then a few things to be aware of if there's a young person with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or hyperthyroidism, you need to be cautious, but these cautions are relative because, again, they're already getting a big dose of nicotine. So we're trying to get them off of it. And these are not reasons to not try to get them quit. And then you've seen these products available in the stores. Again, we have to prescribe them if they're for under 18. However, the patches are easy to use once a day, depending on the level of addiction, 7, 14, or 21 milligrams. I typically, if they're at the point where they want to quit, I will start them at the 14 or the 21. The 7 is probably too low if they're moderate to severely addicted. And if they have some of the side effects, then I'll bump them down to the lower one. But the main issue is if you start them at too low a dose, they'll say it's not working at all. So typically I like to start them at a little bit higher dose and then work from there. So that's the patch. The gum, we've seen this before. So it's not like regular chewing gum, but you have to chew it a little bit and then park the gum. And same thing, you want to feel that tingling sensation in there. So this is also, you wean it down over time. I start my patients on a 4 milligram, again, to meet any cravings. They can take one piece. I actually tell them they can take 1 or 2 if they really have to. Because again, the goal is to get them off of, the electronic nicotine devices. And so what we want to do is move them over to these nicotine replacement therapies and then adjust based on that. And so, the gum is easily accessible, relatively easy to use. So we use that, or you can use the lozenge. It depends on what seems to work better, but I don't have a preference in terms of these two things. So either gum or lozenge to meet the cravings. And then, so I do 4 weeks of this, and then if they feel okay with the level of control, then bump them down to the lower level patch. And then when they have less cravings, bump them down to the 2 milligram gum or lozenge. Okay, close to the end here. So everybody likes Farside, I hope. So kind of the summary here that we all know about: vaping harmful, nicotine plus acid equals nicotine salts, which makes it easier to take your nicotine more quickly and at higher amounts, and leading to extreme addiction. We know that the brain is still developing up until the mid-20s, so it's more susceptible to nicotine. The chemicals that we use for flavors and the solvent are harmful in their own ways. And then we do not recommend this at all for cessation, and it's definitely not a cessation device because they just dumped it on the market and put it out there. So that's a myth that needs to be dispelled. And also remember that ratio, maybe 1 adult can quit based on this, but 81 young people will start if these products are on the market. These are actually active links, so if you want to share the talk, we actually went over this one, supporting youth who are addicted to nicotine, talking to teens about tobacco, which is the fact sheet, and then the nicotine replacement therapy is that whole section that we went over as well. So that information is easily accessible online. Thank you all for listening to me ramble for the past half hour. We can go over and discuss, but if you need to reach me or my staff, the phone number here is 983-6013, or you can email us at smokefreefamilies@capilani.org, or you can reach me directly at my email, bmih@hawaii.edu. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mee. Now, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. If you have questions, please raise your hand and we'll have you ask the question. Yeah. Go ahead, Ted. Yeah.
So maybe you mentioned this, I'm not sure, but has there been systematic research regarding NRT for adolescents?
Okay, so systematic research on NRT for adolescents, there has been, um, the studies haven't been conclusive. So they either show no benefit or slight benefit in terms of using it in adolescents. So the difference is, they've done studies using NRT in adults and it's been effective. So that's kind of, what we're comparing to. And then when they do the studies in adolescents, I think, some of the reasons is because their brain is still developing as well. So there's a difference there. The effectiveness of the NRT is not as high. So that's why we say don't just use NRT by itself, but you do need to use it with the behavioral therapies. And it is more difficult to do things in adolescence, both in terms of research and making clinical changes. And actually, just changing their minds in general, the way that teenagers think is different from what adults think. So they don't want to be told what to do. Some of it is, people say, oh, you can just educate them, but how do you educate someone? Is it more likely that they'll change behavior from an adult telling them or talking to them, or are they more likely to make changes based on peer influence, or these days, what social media person that they follow? And the answer is obviously the latter, but the hard part is how do we frame a message that's effective, that gets out there, because the tobacco and nicotine industry has, millions of dollars spent on the psychology of influencing adolescent minds. And so, we're combating that issue, but they honestly are very effective and very skilled at doing this.
Oh yeah, no, I think it would probably work. I don't see any reason why NRT wouldn't work
Mhm.
with adolescents.
Yeah.
But perhaps there just hasn't been a lot of studies. I know there'd be a lot of challenges to doing such a study. But I was just wondering how many people have actually tried, to do a study on the topic.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think it's just the same thing where we have challenges in getting consent. You have to get it from the adolescent, and you have to get it from the parent. And is it easy to do? No, nothing's ever easy to do in the adolescent age group, in terms of doing research. But we would love to see more studies. I guess from my standpoint, we haven't seen significant harm from doing NRT in adolescents. I think that was the worry before, that if we did NRT, we unexpectedly have some sort of problem, right? But honestly, they're already administering nicotine to themselves in pretty high doses. So the NRT is just, I mean, it's the nicotine without all the other stuff, but it's also a more controlled environment. Whether it's effective, that's probably the key question there, right? So it's either something, we recommend it because it's something to do, right? That's the thing. Parents, teachers, um, they say, please do something, but that's the hardest part, right? Is figuring out which of these somethings to do is actually truly effective. So the behavioral interventions, they do have some evidence that doing the texting, doing group counseling is actually more effective in teenagers than doing one-on-one, because of that peer pressure aspect. There's studies that show that doing a lot more exercise combined with that is also effective. So I think a lot of the things point towards doing things that are, kind of group related rather than individually related, being a little bit more beneficial in this age group.
Yeah, thanks. I agree.
Dr. Wills.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, you mentioned anecdotal evidence earlier in your talk, and to me, that's still one of the major things about testifying in policy, trying to influence policy, because we spent time testifying at the legislature, and it's almost guaranteed, either in the initial hearing or the small hearing later, you'll get one legislator who says, "Well, my uncle, he used e-cigarettes. He'd been a smoker for 20 years, and he tried an e-cigarette, and overnight he quit, and he never smoked again." And this really goes over in a legislative hearing. People really react to this and say, "Oh my God, if that's what happens, then they must be really good." Now, I assume you've heard this before.
Mhm.
Do you have any particular recommendations on how we could deal with this? Because it keeps coming up.
Yeah, so the folks over at Hi-Fi, Hawaii Public Health Institute, Scott Stensrud runs the youth group, and they're always out there. They're trying to find stories of young people who face these challenges. It's hard, right? Because you're testifying during work hours or school hours, and that's not an easy thing to set aside time to wait in your line for however long to have your 2 minutes or less of being able to testify uh, amongst all these other people. So that's a pretty big time and energy commitment. But yeah, getting these stories out is good. I've spoken to the press, and some of you have spoken to the press before, and it's getting the stories out. The public response to crisis situations. So the year that Ivali was all over the place, that probably was the time that they were going to pass a little bit more meaningful legislation, but then COVID rolled around and caused all kind of havoc. So now we're kind of stuck back where it doesn't make it to the top of a lot of legislators' priority list, and so it gets put on the back burner year after year. um, I say work with the folks over at Hi-Fi, because they have the organizational wherewithal to influence legislators, and they have a plan too. So I know some of you may sit on the Coalition for Tobacco-Free Hawaii work groups as well. I think we meet every couple of weeks or so, more often during the legislative season, to figure out what's the best strategy. It's frustrating because as a doctor, I'm like, clearly this is harmful, let's do something about it. But year after year, we kind of hit a lot of the same walls. The bills die in committee, they get what we call gutted and replaced, right? So we have a flavor ban bill, but someone gets to it. There's sneaky lobbyists that say they're working individually, but they're getting paid a ton by the tobacco and nicotine industry. So there's dirty tricks at play. Getting individual stories out is probably very effective. So the anecdotal information is more effective than presenting folks with data. That putting out 1 out of 3 high schoolers are using e-cigarettes. Okay, great. So that's 1 out of 3. But my kid, he's one of the 2 out of 3 that doesn't. Right? He's a good kid. That's what parents are maybe thinking in their mind. It's things like that, and so it's so pervasive now too that it's more difficult, because we could see this thing coming down the road like over a decade ago, right? We saw this product come on the market, put all the warnings, people are like, nah, it's not going to be a big deal. Now it's a big deal, but we're kind of working against what's out there, and it's a challenge. I don't have a good answer for you other than we should, if you know someone who has a compelling story and is willing to talk about it, let's get them in front of a camera. We have media contacts that we can talk to, and some of the folks in media are allies. Some of them are they only report on it if there's a big thing to talk about. So it's always whatever is on top of the crisis list. But since we don't have a crisis, sometimes we do have to generate our own news. And so, yeah, we just have to keep connecting and getting the stories out. And so I'm frustrated because I would love to see some of these like, low hanging fruit things, honestly, from a medical standpoint, just be taken care of on a legislative level.
So we have a question from Katie Walsh.
Hi, sorry, I'm looking at my other screen.
Okay.
So I know that you talked a little bit about some of the hotlines that you can call and some interventions that physicians can do. But my background and training is actually in psychology and clinical psychology. And so I was actually wondering what the resources at Kapiolani, what kind of behavioral health resources are available for doing those kinds of smoking interventions.
So for Kapiolani smoke-free families, the grant that we got from Hawaii Community Foundation is to do cessation for folks that are 18 and above. So it is tricky, right? So, people will call for advice on what do I do with my teenager that needs to quit. Can you help them because you're at Kapiolani? Unfortunately, the answer is no. I'm able to provide information on the side just as a private pediatrician who also works on a national level with the AAP, and in my role also locally with the Hawaii AAP chapter. But yeah, we don't have great resources. We're told basically, refer them to the quit line, and they have either the phone number or a texting thing. You've seen the same things I have. The texting thing is kind of automated as well. There's some more things that are available on a national level. I'm sorry, I forget, because we did have a discussion about this on apps that you can use for teenagers as well. A lot of them are similar to like the chatbot things, right? So it'll check in certain times of the day. It'll say things like, how are you feeling? Are you having cravings? And it'll be kind of the automated response. And then if any of the things are red flagged, like, I feel really down, or, anything like that, it'll get bumped to, a human to review, to interact with them directly. There's similar type of apps for depression and adolescents as well, because of the limited access, after COVID, and the vast majority who were trying to get in, and the waiting list got longer. So these are for, folks that are probably, maybe pre-contemplative to contemplative, but not yet ready to quit. Sometimes they're helpful in a way to kind of just guide them a few steps closer. Unfortunately, yeah, at Kapiolani, we don't have that specific resource yet. I think it's something that we brought up at each of the grantee meetings for Hawaii Community Foundation to come up with. Sorry, I'm going off the top of my head. I know they had a discussion about doing some sort of adolescent cessation grant sometime soon. So you may see something on that. And usually when they do that, I think there's a handful of grants or pilot programs that will happen, usually at the community clinics to start with. So I don't have information for that yet, but that has been something that's been asked for a lot, and it's should be happening, but probably not as soon as we'd like.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to know. And it sounds like I know the research, like you said, the group-based and then the apps, what I know is that if people do think that there is a person on the other side, that they can be more effective. And it sounds like all of those things are happening, which is nice.
So Dr. Mee, I have a question. Are you aware of what's going on in middle and high schools? What do they do with kids who are caught with, using electronic cigarettes?
Okay, so what to do with the kids? So we'll kind of backtrack a little bit and say, from the AAP level, we actually, the recommendation is not to punish the kids. The recommendation is to go after the suppliers, right? So the vape shops that sell these things, right? So the retailers, having restrictions on them, because what you're basically doing is punishing the victims, right? So is it their fault that they're addicted to nicotine? Not so much, right? Is it their fault that they started in the first place? Well, these are adolescent brains that are easily influenced, and there's, the product is out there and there's the peer pressure. It's hard, right? Because there's the punitive measures. So they'll have things like the bathroom sensors, right? It'll sense the e-cigarette aerosol, and then it'll alarm, and then one of the staff members will go in and you'll get caught, right? So what do you do then? Do you do punishment? Do you do education, which is taking some classes, or do you seek help? And so different schools do different things, honestly. A lot of the parents want punishment or something similar, right? Because they just don't want the kids to do it, and they want kind of that model of like, well, if you do this, the consequence is something bad. So don't do this because you're trying to avoid trouble. Whereas we're trying to put forth that it's not the adolescent's fault that they are addicted, and we need to help them. So the punitive model is not as effective, but what we want to do is restrict the sales of it. So things like not having a vape shop within a certain distance, a quarter mile of any school. Really having folks check IDs and so forth before they sell these things. We know that they'll find ways, right? You can order them online, and you can lie about your age, or you just have someone who has an older brother or sister just go ahead and buy them and then just give them to you. There are kids who are not as closely supervised, so they get access to it, and then they just resell it on their own out of their backpacks, for a little bit of profit. It's a difficult thing because I think a lot of the teachers and other staff are stuck, right? Because they're in class, and then someone will just sneak a hit, and then they'll hide it really quickly. And they can be addicted throughout the whole entire day. Whereas in the old days, it was a lot harder to get your hands on a cigarette, and you'd have to go outside of the classroom and hide, somewhere to be able to smoke it. So you would have more intermittent use, but I've
Yeah.
seen things like hoodies with a little string that is also, you can suck through it, right? It's just
Yeah.
level
So
of access is so much higher.
you're not aware of any plan that DOE has, or how, I mean, what do the counselors at schools are supposed to do? I mean, do they have a guideline that they need to follow if they find kids using e-cigs and these kids are dependent?
I don't know, because the last time I talked to the Hawaii State Teachers Association, I think nobody had a clear plan. Some of the private schools will do the punitive measures. I think a lot of it is dependent on how the administration for that school wants to do things. Some places, the rules are to confiscate the devices, but there's also an issue with when you're handling it, you can get nicotine onto your hands. It's supposed to be a what do you call it, a biohazard or a hazardous chemical as well, and you're supposed to store it that way, but then you're supposed to dispose of it, so it's another liability. I honestly don't know where they're at with the DOE. I'm sure there are lawyers involved at all sorts of levels as well. That's probably a whole nother talk that I don't have expert level advice on. But I know we've had teachers and other school staff come to testify at the legislature, telling us kind of horror stories of how bad it is in the classrooms. How they can't teach anymore because their kids are addicted to vaping, and whenever they turn their back, they're just doing stuff. And it's disruptive. And so, and instead of being able to teach, they're supposed to police them. So it's a huge challenge. I don't have a good answer for you on that, but I guess we should check in with the DOE. I think High Five might have better information than I do, since they do work with the young people, and they coordinate a lot with the DOH, and sometimes DOH talks to the DOE, not always.
Yeah, thank you. I have one more question. As far as prescribing NRT is concerned, I mean, so you said you prescribe NRTs for kids younger than 18. What about for kids 18 to 21? I mean, 21 is the legal purchase age for tobacco nowadays. So can kids between 18 and 21 buy over-the-counter NRT?
Yes, yes. So if you're over 18, you can just buy it over the counter. I mean, as a physician, I can still prescribe it, so they have the exact directions on how to use it, how much to use. But they could just go to the store, buy it off the shelf, and start on their own. And I could just hand them the piece of paper, or they could, Google "how do I quit," and get the same information. It's relatively straightforward. It's not difficult conceptually. It's just doing it and getting started is probably the hardest part.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any question?
I don't have a question, but if anyone wants a copy of the slides, I can send them by email, because Dr. Mia sent them to us as well. So if you would like, you can email me at ckawamoto@cc.hawaii.edu.
I'm sorry for the few typos that are in there. I hate when I go through my slides and I see them, but those are accidental. Feel free to correct them.
All right. Thank you then. Thank you for everyone. Thank you everyone for attending, and definitely thank you, Dr. Mee, for the great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We'll be in touch, Dr. Mee. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Take care.
All right.
I'm gonna log off.
Yeah.